So this is it?
This is the spot.
Behind the rhododendrons?
Behind the rhododendrons, yes.
With the disapproving Dr. Rudd somewhere over there.
Hopefully
To be perfectly honest, I think the rhododendrons were a shrubbery too far. None of this would matter if something dramatic hadn't happened to Constable's painting at around this time, but it did. Between 1808, when he painted this view of the rectory, and 1810, when he painted this one, Constable had begun a whole series of vivid oil sketches, private experimental works, painted outdoors, which he would never actually exhibit, but which would prove the bedrock of his greatest work. This sunrise is full of hope. It was painted just as the love affair was getting underway. Suddenly there's a new vividness and fluidity in the painting. I was beginning to think that his infatuation with Maria changed everything. By 1812 he's no longer welcome at the rectory, and you can feel his yearning as he writes to her from his parents' house. From the window where I am writing, I see all those sweet fields where we have passed so many happy hours together. It's with a melancholy pleasure that I revisit those scenes that once saw us so happy. Yet it is gratifying to me to think that the scenes of my boyish days should have witnessed by far the most affecting event of my life. Whatever did or did not happen in those fields, Constable's art had changed forever. And there was another painting from this time which I had to see. It was a sunset over the River Stour, which was being cleaned by conservator Sarah Cove.
There you are. That's a nice dramatic bit of wet in wet painting. It looks like raspberry ripple ice cream, doesn't it?
It's fantastic.
Looking at the painting, it brings you very close to the actual physical presence of Constable. I mean, you can virtually see the brush and his hand actually applying that stroke. That's a quick bristle brush stroke, very dramatic. And then he comes along more or less immediately and puts in this incredibly delicate little wet in wet stroke.
Oh yeah.
With a tiny, fine, sable-haired brush. It's so small, this stroke, and that is actually the trunk of the tree.
If you take your science hat off for a minute, I mean, what kind of do you get a sense of feeling or emotion from the Constable said paintings, in other words, for feeling? What kind of feelings do you get?
Well, I think it's really responsive to a sunset. You know, if you actually look at sunsets and you look at clouds, which I do actually since I've been studying Constable, it has made me look at nature in a different way. You see, you know, how wonderful the sky is and how it changes. And the fact that he was also doing on 3 almost sequential evenings paintings of sunsets seems to me that he was either sort of, you know, lurking outside for some reason, maybe waiting to meet Maria, walking down the towpath, or he was actually thinking, right, you know, this week I'm going to do a study of sunsets, and he's really responding to it.
My intuition is that it's an extraordinary coincidence that he suddenly starts painting like this once he's met this woman. And, you know, I think that it's love coming through in the paint, it's emotion. Suddenly his feelings are there in the way he's painting.
It does get very sort of spontaneous, passionate. He's very involved in it, you know, it's very physical. Once he gets to the oil sketches around about 1810, they really, really take off. And he's obviously got the ability to do it, but he's really fired up.
The paintings can only tell us so much, and the story has to be taken up by the 200-odd letters between John and Maria. I went to visit their great-great-grandson, Richard Constable, to see the originals.
What's the sort of family tradition about this relationship? What were Maria and John like?
They obviously fell madly in love with each other. I always used to think that she wasn't worthy of him, but I've come round to thinking quite differently now. Originally, she was willing to forego the marriage, even though they loved each other, if it was going to upset her father.
But then they committed to each other, didn't they? Really, through thick or thin, that's my impression.
Until 1812, their letters were formal, very formal, and then suddenly they threw away that formality and they started to express real devotion to each other. It still lingered on another 4 years before they actually got married.
Do you think they did or didn't, as it were, cheat during the 7-year engagement, or
What, did they ever live together or have relations?
did they ever have relations, do you think?
It's a very delicate way of putting it. I'm sure they didn't. For a start, I don't think they would have thought like that in those days. Maria was either with her father or other relations, but quite apart from that, I'm sure they never would have even have considered to behave in that way before they were married.
So when Constable says in one of his letters, we have nothing to reproach ourselves for, you think that we should really take that at face value?
Well, I do. I believe that, yeah. They mind you after they were married, of course. We'll get.
Well, only 7 children in 12 years, yeah.
I think that's the only thing I slightly reproach him for, apart from his acid tongue. This poor dying woman, still having children the year she died, which can't have done her any good, medically. But he so adored her, he couldn't leave her alone.
Richard Constable showed me some other rather touching mementos that had been passed down in the family.
This is his baby rattle.
Oh, I thought it was his dope pipe for a minute. That's lovely, isn't it? That's sweet.
Yeah. And this is Mariah's wedding ring. It is very delicate.
It's a fantastically thin piece of gold, isn't it?
In 1811, Constable had in fact been received at the Bicknells' London home, but in June Maria was out of town, probably a deliberate strategy on the part of her father. The effect of her absence was devastating on Constable, and his first letter to her, for which he wrote several drafts, craves permission to correspond with her. Maria replies that she will have to ask her father. The first response is negative, but not hopeless. Clearly, Constable isn't personally disliked by Charles Bicknell, who was solicitor to George IV and knew the king reasonably well. The problem was, as she put it, the necessary article, cash. But little more than a month later, something had changed.
Maria Bicknell decided, on the advice of her father, that there was no future in the relationship with Constable, and she wrote him a classic Dear John letter, unequivocally severing relations between them. Well, Constable was overwhelmed with shock, obviously, by the letter, and went round personally to make representations to Maria.
But she wasn't around the corner in London. She was a day's hard carriage ride away down in Bewdley, near Worcester. She was staying in a house called Spring Grove with her widowed half-sister, Mrs. Skye, well out of the way of the handsome miller, or so they thought. Constable was admitted to the house by Mrs. Skye. His charm clearly worked on her, and forever after he was most particular in sending her his compliments whenever Maria was there. Presumably some long, hard talking between Constable and Maria followed. Their future was in the balance. Our only source for what happened is a letter to Maria written after the event. He wrote to say that some of the happiest hours of my life were passed at Spring Grove, mixed as they were with moments of unutterable sadness. It was a winter weekend, foul weather, but the couple still made it out to the grounds, which had been landscaped by Capability Brown in the latest picturesque fashion. Constable's letter continues, I was happy to see that you possess many sources of amusement. Nowadays, it's a safari park and fairground. Whatever Constable said to Maria during those 3 days, he must have been pretty convincing, because by the end of the weekend, she had, after all, decided to commit herself to him. And as far as he was concerned, that was it. he'd pursue her with the same dedication that he pursued landscape painting. He went back to London, and from now on the pattern of their relationship was to be one of snatched meetings, furtive meetings. But even if he couldn't see her very often, he could think of her. And he writes a very touching letter a few months after their meeting here to say, "I cannot tell you how glad I am that I have seen Spring Grove. You're by no means lost to me. I can now walk with you," he means walk in his head, "to almost any part of the grounds, and I do not allow an hour to pass without being with you." He sees her when she's not there. It's an interesting letter, because I think it marks the beginning of that process whereby Constable comes to associate Maria and the landscape together in his mind.